Lieutenant Masao Kobayashi never expected to survive the crash, and he certainly never expected what came after. Bruised, broken, and bleeding on enemy soil, he braced himself for the torture his commanders had promised would come from American hands. But when a young Army nurse named Margaret Wilson knelt beside him with gentle hands and a soft smile, offering him water and whispering words he could barely understand, something inside him cracked open. This wasn't the enemy he'd been trained to hate. This was something he couldn't explain, something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The question burning in his mind as she wrapped his shattered arm was simple but earth-shattering. Had everything he believed been a lie? Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The sky above Guam burned with the colors of war on that humid afternoon in August 1945. Lieutenant Masao Kobayashi gripped the controls of his Mitsubishi A6M0 fighter with hands that trembled not from fear, but from the violent shaking of his damaged aircraft. Black smoke poured from the engine, obscuring his vision as the acrid smell of burning oil filled the cramped cockpit. His radio crackled with static and the distant voices of his squadron, voices that grew fainter with each passing second as they pulled away, retreating back toward the diminishing reaches of the Japanese Empire. He was 23 years old, the son of a schoolteacher from Kyoto, and he was about to die on a foreign island thousands of miles from home. The American fighters had come out of the sun, just as his instructors had warned they would. Kobayashi had managed to evade the first pass, his training and instincts taking over as he threw his Zero into a desperate climbing turn. But there were too many of them, their powerful engines giving them an advantage his lighter aircraft couldn't match. The burst of .50 caliber rounds that tore through his wing came from nowhere, the metallic shriek of ripping aluminum mixing with the roar of his failing engine. He'd felt the impact through the stick, the sudden sluggishness that told him his aircraft was finished. The decision to stay with the plane rather than bail out wasn't really a decision at all. The altitude was too low, the jungle too thick below. He would ride it down and hope that the Emperor's divine protection would see him through to an honorable death. The crash came faster than he expected. One moment, he was fighting to keep the nose up, aiming for what looked like a clearing in the dense tropical vegetation. The next, the world exploded in a chaos of breaking branches, tearing metal, and a force that slammed him forward against his harness with such violence that his vision went white. He remembered thinking, with strange clarity, of his mother's face the last time he'd seen her at the train station in Osaka. Her eyes wet with tears, she was too proud to let fall. Then there was only darkness and the distant sound of something burning. When consciousness returned, it came in waves of searing pain. His left arm felt wrong, bent at an angle that made his stomach lurch. Blood ran down his face from a gash above his eyebrow, and when he tried to move, every muscle in his body screamed in protest. The canopy of his Zero was shattered, and through the broken plexiglass he could see palm fronds and patches of impossibly blue sky. Smoke still rose from somewhere behind him, and he could hear the crackle of flames consuming what remained of his aircraft. He needed to move, needed to get away before the fuel tank exploded, but his body refused to obey. With a groan that sounded like it came from someone else, Kobayashi managed to release his harness. He half fell, half crawled out of the cockpit, landing in the soft earth and rotting vegetation of the jungle floor. The heat was oppressive, a wet, suffocating blanket that made each breath a labor. He lay there for a moment, trying to gather his strength, trying to remember his training about what to do if captured. Destroy all documents. Reveal nothing but name, rank, and serial number. Expect no mercy. The Americans were barbarians, he'd been told, who tortured prisoners for sport and killed the wounded where they lay. Better to die fighting or by one's own hand than to fall into their clutches. His service pistol was still in its holster. Kobayashi's right hand, the one that still worked, moved toward it with agonizing slowness. He would wait until they came, and then he would take as many as he could before turning the final bullet on himself. It was the honorable thing to do, the only thing to do. His fingers had just closed around the grip when he heard voices, American voices, harsh and foreign and terrifyingly close. He tried to pull the weapon free, but his injured arm betrayed him, causing him to cry out in pain. The voices grew louder, more urgent, and then there were boots crushing through the undergrowth, and dark shapes moving between the trees. 3 American Marines emerged from the jungle, their weapons trained on him. Kobayashi froze, his hand still on his pistol, waiting for the bullets that would end his shame. But they didn't fire. Instead, one of them, a tall man with sergeant stripes on his filthy uniform, barked something in English and gestured with his rifle. When Kobayashi couldn't move, the sergeant stepped closer, his face hard but not cruel. With a swift motion, he kicked the pistol away from Kobayashi's hand, sending it spinning into the undergrowth. Another Marine, younger with fear barely concealed in his eyes, kept his rifle pointed at Kobayashi's chest, while the third began searching through the wreckage of the Zero. The sergeant knelt beside Kobayashi, his eyes scanning the injuries with what looked almost like concern. He said something else in English, his tone less harsh now, almost questioning. Kobayashi stared back, understanding nothing, expecting everything. This was when the torture would begin. This was when they would make him pay for every American who had died in this terrible war. But instead, the sergeant pulled a canteen from his belt, and after a moment's hesitation, held it to Kobayashi's lips. Water, warm and tasting of metal, flooded his mouth. It was the most precious thing he'd ever tasted, and he hated himself for accepting it, for showing such weakness before the enemy. They carried him out of the jungle on a stretcher, fashioned from branches, and a shelter half, the movement sending fresh waves of agony through his broken body. Kobayashi drifted in and out of consciousness during the journey, catching glimpses of a landscape that seemed alien and hostile. Bomb craters pockmarked the earth. Burned-out vehicles sat abandoned by the roadside. Everywhere, there were Americans. More Americans than he'd ever imagined existed, all moving with the purposeful efficiency of an army that knew it had already won. Through the haze of pain and shock, he wondered what had happened to the war, to the divine wind that was supposed to sweep the enemy from the Pacific, to the final victory that the Emperor had promised. The field hospital was a collection of tents erected near the beach, their canvas sides flapping in the tropical breeze. The smell hit him first, a mixture of disinfectant, blood, and the underlying sweetness of gangrene that he recognized from the field hospitals he'd visited back in the Philippines. They brought him to a tent marked with a red cross, laying the stretcher on the ground, while someone, a doctor perhaps, shouted orders in that incomprehensible language. Hands, surprisingly gentle, began cutting away his flight suit, exposing the mottled purple bruises that covered his torso. He tried to maintain his dignity, to show no pain, but when they moved his broken arm, he couldn't stop the scream that tore from his throat. Then she appeared, and everything changed. Margaret Wilson was 26 years old, an army nurse from a small town in Iowa that Kobayashi had never heard of and never would. She had brown hair pulled back in a neat bun, eyes the color of the autumn sky back home, and hands that moved with practiced efficiency. She knelt beside his stretcher, and when their eyes met, she didn't look at him with hatred or disgust. There was no triumph in her gaze, no satisfaction at seeing an enemy broken and defeated. Instead, there was something he couldn't name, something that looked almost like compassion. She said something soft in English, her voice like music, and then those gentle hands began examining his injuries. Kobayashi wanted to pull away, to refuse her touch, to maintain the wall of hatred that was supposed to exist between them. But he was too weak, too broken, and somewhere deep inside, a part of him that he'd tried to bury, recognized the simple humanity in her actions. She cleaned the blood from his face with a damp cloth, her movements careful and precise. When she touched the gash above his eyebrow, probing to see if his skull was fractured, her fingers were feather-light. She spoke to him again, and though he couldn't understand the words, the tone was unmistakable. She was trying to comfort him, to let him know that he was safe, that he would be cared for. The doctor, a tired-looking captain with silver hair and tobacco-stained fingers, came to set Kobayashi's arm. It was going to hurt, Margaret tried to explain through gestures and simple words he couldn't grasp. They had morphine, blessed morphine that could take away the pain, but it was in short supply, and reserved for American boys who'd given so much for their country. For an enemy pilot, there would be nothing but perhaps a leather strap to bite down on. But Margaret, sweet Margaret, whose name he wouldn't learn for another day, held his good hand in both of hers as the doctor worked. Her grip was strong, her eyes locked on his, and somehow, impossibly, that human connection made the agony bearable. When it was over, when his arm was splinted and wrapped, when the doctor had moved on to the next patient, Margaret remained. She brought him water in a tin cup, holding it to his lips with the same care his mother had shown when he was sick as a child. Each sip was a small rebellion against everything he'd been taught, every propaganda poster that had shown Americans as demons, every speech that had promised they would show no mercy. Here was mercy, unasked for and unearned, flowing from the hands of a woman whose country he had tried to destroy, whose people he had killed from the sky. Kobayashi's mind struggled to reconcile what he was experiencing with what he believed. Perhaps this was a trick, a cunning strategy to make him lower his guard before the real interrogation began. Perhaps they were saving him for something worse, some public humiliation or show trial. But as the hours passed and Margaret returned again and again, checking his bandages, bringing him weak broth that his stomach could tolerate, speaking to him in that soft voice, even though she knew he couldn't understand, doubt began to creep into his certainty. This woman, this enemy, was treating him with more kindness than he'd seen in the last 2 years of service to the Emperor. Night fell over the island, bringing a brief respite from the crushing heat. The hospital tent was lit by lanterns that cast dancing shadows on the canvas walls. Kobayashi lay on a cot, one of dozens that held broken men in various states of repair. Most were Americans, boys who'd been torn apart by Japanese bullets and shells, who'd given pieces of themselves to this island. They should have hated him. He was the enemy, the reason for their suffering. But when their eyes fell on him, he saw only exhaustion and a kind of hollow indifference. They were too tired, too hurt, to muster hatred for one broken pilot who could no longer do them harm. Margaret worked through the night, moving from bed to bed, with tireless dedication. Kobayashi watched her when he thought she wasn't looking, studying this woman who had upended everything he thought he knew. She laughed with the wounded soldiers, her smile bringing light to faces gray with pain. She held the hands of dying men, whispering words of comfort as they slipped away from the world. And periodically, she would return to him, checking his vital signs, adjusting his bandages, offering sips of water, treating him no differently than she treated her own countrymen. It was during one of these visits, perhaps the 4th or 5th of the night, that Kobayashi found the courage to speak. His English was poor, learned from a year at a technical school before the war, rusty from disuse. But he had to know, had to understand why. Margaret was adjusting the mosquito netting around his cot when he whispered the question that had been burning inside him. Why? The word came out rough, barely audible. Why you help enemy? Margaret paused, her hands still on the netting. For a moment, Kobayashi thought she hadn't heard him, or perhaps didn't understand. But then she turned, and in the lamplight, he could see her face clearly. There was sadness there, and weariness, but also something unbreakable, some core of strength that all the war and death couldn't touch. She thought about her answer carefully, choosing simple words that he might comprehend. "Because you're a human being," she said slowly, each word deliberate. "Because if I become like the war, then the war has won. Because my mama taught me that every life matters, even yours." Kobayashi didn't understand all the words, but he grasped the meaning, and it shattered something inside him. Tears, unbidden and unwanted, began to stream down his face. He'd been taught that Americans had no honor, no humanity, that they were less than human themselves. But here was a woman who embodied everything his culture claimed to value: compassion, duty, sacrifice, and she wore an enemy uniform. The cognitive dissonance was too much, and for the first time since childhood, Masao Kobayashi wept. Margaret didn't say anything more. She simply pulled up a stool and sat beside his cot, her presence a silent comfort. She didn't try to stop his tears or tell him everything would be fine. She just stayed, one human being offering solace to another, while outside the tent, the war ground on with its terrible momentum. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of heat, pain, and slow healing. Kobayashi's physical wounds were mending, his arm set properly now with real plaster, the gash on his head stitched closed by skilled hands. But the wound Margaret had opened in his soul grew wider with each passing day. He began to learn more English, picking up words from Margaret and the other nurses, from the doctors, and even from some of the American patients who were curious about the enemy pilot in their midst. Communication became easier, and with it came understanding, terrible and beautiful in equal measure. Margaret told him about her life before the war, about growing up on a farm in Iowa where the corn grew tall and the winters were brutally cold. She spoke of her father who'd served in the First World War, who'd come home broken in ways that had nothing to do with the body, and how that had inspired her to become a nurse. She showed him a photograph she kept in her pocket, creased and faded from constant handling, of a young man in a pilot's uniform. Her fiancé, she explained with eyes that couldn't quite hide the pain, who'd been shot down over Germany 6 months ago. Missing, presumed dead. The revelation stunned Kobayashi into silence. Here was a woman who had every reason to hate him, to see in him the face of everyone who'd taken someone she loved, and yet she'd shown him nothing but kindness. The magnitude of her forgiveness, or perhaps her ability to see past uniform and nationality to the common humanity beneath, was almost incomprehensible. He tried to apologize, stumbling over words in 2 languages, but she stopped him with a gentle hand on his shoulder. "It's not your fault," she said, and he could hear the effort it took her to mean it. "You're not responsible for what happened to Jimmy any more than you're responsible for this whole damn war. We're all just caught up in something bigger than ourselves, and the only thing we can control is how we treat each other in the midst of it." Kobayashi learned about America through these conversations, and what he learned contradicted everything he'd been taught. He learned about democracy, about the idea that people could choose their leaders and speak against them without fear. He learned about the mixing of cultures that made up American society, the immigrants from everywhere who'd built something new together. He learned about their dreams and fears, their loves and losses, and he realized with growing horror that they were just like the people back home. The Americans wanted peace. They wanted to go home to their families. They'd been pulled into this war just as he had, by forces beyond their control and leaders who spoke of duty and honor and sacrifice. Other nurses and doctors visited him as his condition improved, some curious, some resentful, all professional. A chaplain, a kindly man with wire-rimmed glasses and a gentle manner, sat with him one afternoon and tried to talk about faith and forgiveness. Kobayashi listened politely, though the Christian concepts were foreign to his Buddhist upbringing. But he appreciated the gesture, the attempt to reach across the vast divide of culture and conflict to offer spiritual comfort. Even here, even with an enemy, these Americans extended their humanity. News filtered into the hospital from the outside world, and with it came the gradual understanding that the war was ending. The whispers started in early August, growing louder and more insistent. Something terrible had happened to Japanese cities, weapons of unimaginable power that could destroy everything in an instant. Kobayashi's broken English wasn't good enough to fully grasp the technical details, but he understood the results. Hiroshima, Nagasaki. Names that would be seared into history, into the collective memory of his nation. Hundreds of thousands dead in moments. And then, finally, the surrender. When Margaret told him that Japan had capitulated, that the emperor himself had spoken on the radio to announce the end of hostilities, Kobayashi felt his world collapse. Everything he'd fought for, everyone who'd died, all the sacrifice and suffering, it had been for nothing. Japan had lost, utterly and completely, and the divine nation he'd been raised to believe was invincible had been brought to its knees. He should have felt shame, dishonor, the burning need to end his life, rather than face such defeat. But instead, lying in that hospital tent with his arm in a cast and an American nurse's hand resting gently on his shoulder, he felt only a strange, guilty relief. The war was over. He had survived. And perhaps, just perhaps, there was a chance to build something different from the ashes. The hospital began to empty, as the wounded were evacuated to larger facilities or sent home. The tent that had once held dozens of patients now housed only a handful, Kobayashi among them. He was well enough to be moved to a prisoner of war camp, well enough to begin the uncertain journey that awaited all captured enemy combatants. But Margaret advocated for him to stay a few more days, claiming his arm needed additional observation. It was a transparent fiction, and they both knew it. But the doctors were too busy preparing for the post-war reorganization to argue about one Japanese pilot. On what would be his last day at the field hospital, Margaret brought Kobayashi outside for the first time since his capture. The war was truly over now, the dangers that had kept him confined to the tent no longer relevant. She helped him to a spot beneath a palm tree where he could look out at the ocean, that vast expanse of blue that separated him from everything he'd known. They sat in silence for a while, watching the waves roll in, each lost in thoughts about the future that loomed uncertain before them. "What will happen to you?" Margaret asked finally, her voice barely audible over the sound of the surf. Kobayashi considered the question. His English had improved dramatically over the weeks, enough that he could express complex thoughts if he chose his words carefully. "I will go to prison camp, I think. Wait to go home to Japan. If there is still home to go to." The news about the atomic bombs had been vague, but horrifying. He didn't know if Kyoto still stood, if his parents had survived, if there would be anything left of the country he'd fought for. "I hope," Margaret said, choosing her words with care, "that you'll remember this time. Not the war, not the fighting, but what came after. I hope you'll remember that enemies can become friends, that hatred doesn't have to be forever." She paused, gathering courage for what she wanted to say next. "The world is going to need people like you, Masao. People who've seen both sides, who understand that the other side is human too. People who can help build bridges instead of walls." It was the first time she'd used his given name, and hearing it from her lips, pronounced carefully in her American accent, made his throat tighten with emotion. He turned to look at her, this woman who had changed everything, who had shattered his understanding of the world and rebuilt it into something more complex and more beautiful. "I will remember," he said, and it was a promise. "I will remember always. What you do for me, what you teach me. In Japan, we have word giri, it means duty, obligation to someone who show you kindness. I have giri to you, to all American people, to tell as I truth about what I see here." Margaret smiled, but there were tears in her eyes. "Just tell the truth about what people can be when they choose kindness over cruelty. That's all I ask." They sat together until the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded Kobayashi of home. Tomorrow, he would leave this place, would begin the long process of returning to a Japan that no longer existed, at least not in the form he'd known. But tonight, for these last few hours, he could sit beside a friend, an impossible friend, born from the ashes of war, and believe that the future might hold something better than the past. The transport truck came for him at dawn. Margaret was there to see him off, professional in her white uniform, her hair neatly pinned despite the early hour. She'd brought him a small package, wrapped in brown paper, tied with string. When he opened it, he found a photograph, the one she'd shown him of her fiancé, and beneath it, a small New Testament in English. "For your journey," she explained. "The photograph is to remember that we've all lost people we loved to this war, that grief doesn't belong to one side or another, it's something we share. And the book," she touched it gently, "is because I think you're searching for something, Masao. Maybe you'll find some answers in there, maybe you won't, but at least it'll help you practice your English." Kobayashi wanted to refuse the photograph, knowing how precious it must be to her, but he understood the gift for what it was. A reminder of their shared humanity, of the connections that transcended nationality and conflict. He bowed deeply, in the formal Japanese manner, holding the bow longer than necessary because he didn't trust his voice to work. "Thank you," he managed finally, the English words inadequate for everything he felt. "For my life, for showing me truth, for being human to inhuman world." Margaret stepped forward, and breaking every rule of military propriety, hugged him. It was brief, sisterly, but in that moment, Kobayashi felt forgiven for everything he'd done, every bomb he'd dropped, every life he'd helped to end. When she pulled back, her eyes were wet, but she was smiling. "Go home, Masao," she said. "Go home and build something beautiful from all this ugliness. And if you ever get the chance, tell people what happened here. Tell them what's possible when we remember our humanity." The truck pulled away, and Kobayashi watched through the back, until Margaret was just a white speck against the green of the jungle, and then nothing at all. But her words, her kindness, the impossible gift she'd given him, those would stay with him forever. The prisoner of war camp was exactly what he'd expected. Spartan, efficient, organized with typical American thoroughness. But even here, he saw glimpses of the humanity Margaret had shown him. The guards were firm but fair, the food adequate if not appetizing, the treatment correct according to international law. There were other Japanese prisoners, pilots and soldiers, sailors pulled from sinking ships, all of them carrying the same shell-shocked expression of men whose world had ended. Some were bitter, clinging to the propaganda they'd been fed about American brutality, unable to reconcile it with the reality of their treatment. Others, like Kobayashi, had experienced something that challenged their preconceptions, small kindnesses from unexpected sources that hinted at a more complex truth. Kobayashi became something of a translator, his improving English making him useful to both the Americans and his fellow prisoners. In this role, he saw the daily interactions between captor and captive, the small negotiations and compromises that made the camp function. He watched American soldiers share cigarettes with Japanese prisoners, saw them laugh together over the universal frustrations of military bureaucracy, witnessed the slow thawing of hostility into something approaching mutual respect. It wasn't dramatic or sudden, but it was real, and it confirmed everything Margaret had tried to teach him. Letters began to arrive from Japan, forwarded through the Red Cross and military channels. Kobayashi learned that his parents had survived, that Kyoto had been spared the worst of the bombing, that his younger sister had married a farmer and moved to the countryside. The news should have filled him with joy, and it did, but it was complicated by guilt. How could he celebrate his family's survival when so many had lost everything? How could he look forward to returning home when that home had been purchased with the lives of millions? He wrote letters too, carefully composed in his improving English, telling his family about his capture and treatment. He wanted to tell them about Margaret, about the kindness that had saved not just his body but his soul, but he struggled to find the words. How could he explain to people who'd lived through firebombing and starvation and the atomic horror that the enemy had shown him compassion? How could he make them understand that the Americans were not the demons they'd been led to believe? In the end, he wrote simply that he'd been well treated, that he'd seen things that challenged what he thought he knew, and that he would explain everything when he came home. The months passed slowly. Christmas came, strange and foreign, but the American soldiers celebrated it with such joy that even the Japanese prisoners couldn't help but be affected. Kobayashi watched from a distance as they sang carols and exchanged gifts, and he thought about the chaplain who'd visited him in the hospital, about the Christian faith that seemed to inspire such generosity of spirit. He began reading the New Testament Margaret had given him, struggling through the archaic English, using a dictionary borrowed from a sympathetic guard. The teachings he found there, about loving one's enemies, about forgiveness and redemption, resonated with something deep inside him. He didn't convert. His Buddhist upbringing was too deeply ingrained, but he found wisdom in the words, a framework for understanding the mercy he'd been shown. Repatriation began in the spring of 1946. The process was chaotic, thousands of prisoners being processed, documented, and shipped back to a homeland many hadn't seen in years. Kobayashi's turn came on a warm April morning. He boarded a transport ship bound for Yokohama, carrying with him nothing but the clothes he wore, and the small package Margaret had given him, the photograph and the Bible wrapped carefully in oilcloth to protect them from Bren. The salt spray. The voyage home was strange and melancholy. The ship was crowded with returnees, all of them lost in their own thoughts about what awaited them. Some spoke eagerly of reunion with family, of returning to jobs and lives put on hold by the war. Others were silent, haunted by what they'd done, what they'd seen, what they'd become. Kobayashi fell somewhere in between. He wanted to go home, desperately, but he was no longer the young man who'd left. The war had changed him, and Margaret had changed him again, and he didn't know if there would be a place for this new version of himself in the Japan that was rebuilding from the ashes. The first sight of Japan broke something inside every man on that ship. The coastline, once familiar and beloved, was scarred by war. Cities that had stood for centuries were reduced to rubble. The proud nation that had dreamed of empire was humbled, occupied by the very people it had sought to conquer. As they sailed into Yokohama harbor, passing the blackened skeletons of buildings and the rusting hulks of sunken ships, Kobayashi understood viscerally what defeat meant. This was his country, and it was broken. His family met him at the processing center, his mother weeping openly, his father standing stiff and formal, trying to maintain dignity in the face of overwhelming emotion. His sister was there too, her farmer husband awkward in his best clothes, and in her arms, a baby Kobayashi had never met, born while he was fighting a war on the other side of the ocean. They took him home to Kyoto, to a house that had survived when so many others had not, and for the first few days, he simply existed, allowing himself to be fed and fussed over, reconnecting with the rhythms of family life. But the questions came, as he knew they would. What had happened to him? How had he been treated? What were the Americans really like? His father asked with the stern formality of his generation, needing to know if his son had maintained honor in captivity. His mother asked with a mother's concern, needing to know that her child had not suffered. His sister asked with open curiosity, wanting to understand the enemy that had defeated them. And to all of them, Kobayashi told the truth. He spoke of his capture, of his injuries, of his certainty that he would be tortured and killed. And then he spoke of Margaret, of the nurse who had treated him with kindness when she had every reason to hate. He showed them the photograph, explained who the young pilot in the picture was, what he'd meant to Margaret, and what her gift of this precious memento represented. He read passages from the New Testament, translating them into Japanese, showing them the philosophy that had guided his captor's compassion, and he told them, with all the conviction he possessed, that the Americans were not monsters. They were people, just like the Japanese, caught up in the same terrible conflict, and capable of the same capacity for good and evil. His father struggled with this revelation. The old man had lived through the Meiji Restoration, had been raised in the traditions of Bushido, and absolute loyalty to the emperor. The idea that the enemy possessed honor, that they might even be superior in their mercy, challenged everything he'd built his life upon. But he was also a schoolteacher, a man of learning, and he couldn't deny the evidence of his son's experience. Slowly, painfully, he began to accept that the world was more complex than the propaganda had claimed. Kobayashi found work as a translator for the American occupation forces, a position that came with suspicion from some of his countrymen who saw collaboration with the occupiers as betrayal. But he persisted, driven by a sense of purpose that he traced directly back to those weeks in the field hospital. Margaret had asked him to build bridges, to help people see the humanity in their former enemies, and this was how he could fulfill that promise. He worked with American administrators trying to implement democratic reforms, with aid workers distributing food and medicine, with educators rebuilding a school system purged of militaristic indoctrination. And in every interaction, he tried to model the compassion he'd been shown, to be for others what Margaret had been for him. The years passed, and Japan transformed. The occupation ended, giving way to partnership. The economy, devastated by war, began to rebuild with American assistance. Democracy, imposed by the victors, took root and flourished. Kobayashi married, had children of his own, built a career as a professor of English literature, specializing in American authors. He taught generations of students about Hemingway and Steinbeck, about Whitman and Dickinson, but more importantly, he taught them about the people who had created this literature, about the culture that could produce such beauty alongside such capacity for war. He never forgot Margaret. How could he? Every year on the anniversary of his capture, he would take out the photograph and the Bible, looking at them with the same reverence others might show holy relics. He tried to find her after the war, writing letters to the U.S. Army, to veterans organizations, even to the town in Iowa she'd mentioned. But the trail was cold. Margaret Wilson had returned home after the war and disappeared into the vast American landscape, one nurse among thousands, her service noted in military records, but her location unknown to the bureaucracies that tracked such things. In 1971, Kobayashi received an invitation that would change everything again. He was asked to speak at a peace conference in Hawaii, one of a series of events designed to promote reconciliation between former enemies. Japanese and American veterans would gather to share their stories, to acknowledge the past, and affirm their commitment to a peaceful future. Kobayashi accepted immediately, sensing an opportunity not just to fulfill his promise to Margaret, but perhaps, impossibly, to find her. The conference was held at a hotel in Honolulu, a modern building that looked out over the harbor, where the war had begun for America with such devastating suddenness. Kobayashi arrived early, nervous in a way he hadn't been since his first flight as a cadet pilot. The lobby was filled with veterans, American and Japanese, most of them elderly now. Their uniforms replaced by civilian clothes, their weapons traded for cameras and walking sticks. There was awkwardness at first. Old men who'd once tried to kill each other now making small talk through translators. But gradually, tentatively, connections began to form. Kobayashi's speech was scheduled for the second day. He'd prepared remarks about forgiveness and reconciliation, about the necessity of remembering the past without being imprisoned by it. But as he stood at the podium, looking out at the assembled crowd, he found himself abandoning his prepared text. Instead, he told them about Margaret. He told them everything, from his crash and capture to those weeks in the field hospital, from her gentle hands to her impossible kindness. He described the photograph and the Bible, still treasured after all these years. And he told them how one woman's choice to see the humanity in her enemy had changed his entire life, had set him on a path of bridge building that had shaped everything he'd become. The audience was silent when he finished, moved by the simple power of the story. There were tears on faces, American and Japanese alike, these old warriors touched by this tale of compassion in the midst of war. As Kobayashi left the podium, accepting the applause with characteristic Japanese humility, he noticed a commotion near the back of the hall. A woman, elderly now but still upright, was making her way forward, helped by a younger woman who might have been her daughter. There was something familiar about her, something in the way she moved that tugged at memories buried deep. She reached him as he descended from the stage, and when their eyes met, Kobayashi knew. 26 years had passed, her hair had turned silver, lines had etched themselves around her eyes and mouth, that those eyes, that same autumn sky blue, were unmistakable. "Margaret," he breathed, the name coming out in a whisper of disbelief and wonder. "Hello, Masao," she said, and her voice was older, rougher than he remembered, but still carrying that same warmth that had saved his life all those years ago. I hoped it might be you when I saw your name in the program, but I couldn't be sure, couldn't believe that after all this time." They stood there, two old people who had once been young in a time of war, staring at each other while the crowd around them buzzed with curiosity and emotion. And then, simultaneously, they moved together, embracing with the fierce joy of a reunion that neither had dared to dream possible. Margaret was crying, her shoulders shaking, and Kobayashi found his own face wet with tears that he didn't try to hide. "I looked for you," he said when they finally pulled apart, though his hands still gripped her arms as if afraid she might disappear. "For years I looked. I wrote letters, I tried everything I could think of, but I could never find you." Margaret laughed, a sound that was part joy, part regret. "I married after the war, changed my name, moved to California with my husband, a doctor I met at the hospital in San Francisco. Wilson became Patterson, and Margaret Patterson isn't so easy to find when you're Cala." Looking for Margaret Wilson. Her smile faltered slightly. "I looked for you too, you know, But Japanese names, there were so many repatriated prisoners, and the records were such a mess. I hoped you'd made it home, hoped you were well, but I never knew for sure until today. The younger woman who'd helped Margaret forward introduced herself as Elizabeth, Margaret's daughter, and she looked at Kobayashi with undisguised curiosity. "Mom has talked about you my whole life," she said. "The Japanese pilot she helped during the war, the one who made her believe that peace was possible. I used to think you were a story she'd invented to teach us about forgiveness, but here you are, real as anything." Over the next 3 days of the conference, Kobayashi and Margaret were inseparable. They sat together during sessions, ate meals side by side, and spent long hours in the hotel gardens, talking about the years that had passed. Margaret told him about her life after the war, about the difficulty of readjusting to civilian life after everything she'd seen. She spoke of her marriage to Daniel Patterson, a good man who'd understood her nightmares and her need to make meaning from the horror. She'd had 3 children, Elizabeth and 2 sons, had worked as a nurse for another 20 years before retiring, and had spent her later years involved in peace advocacy and veteran support groups. "I never forgot you either," she confessed during one of these conversations, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. You represented something important to me, Masao. Proof that we could choose kindness even in the darkest times, that our humanity didn't have to be a casualty of war. When things got hard, when the nightmares were bad, or when the world seemed too cruel, I'd think about you. I'd remember that, if I could see past hatred to treat an enemy with compassion. Then there was hope for all of us." Kobayashi reached into his jacket and pulled out the oilcloth package he'd carried across the Pacific. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing the photograph and the Bible, both showing their age but still intact. Margaret gasped when she saw them, her hand going to her mouth. "You kept them," she whispered. "All these years, you kept them." "They were my most precious possessions," Kobayashi replied simply. "This photograph, it reminded me always what you lost, what you sacrificed, what it cost you to show kindness to someone like me. And the book, it helped me understand where your strength came from, what made you different." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I tried to live my life in a way that would honor your gift, Margaret. I tried to be for others what you were for me. I don't know if I succeeded, but I tried." Margaret took the photograph with trembling hands, looking at Jimmy's face for the first time in years. "You did succeed," she said softly. "Everything you said in your speech, about teaching understanding between our countries, about building bridges, that's exactly what I hoped would happen. Not just with you, with everyone who saw that we could be better than the war, wanted us to be." And she looked up at him, and in her eyes was a depth of emotion that transcended simple friendship. "You've made my choice matter, Masao. You've proven that one act of kindness can ripple out through the decades, changing lives and touching people I'll never meet. That's more than I ever dared to hope for." On the final evening of the conference, there was a ceremony on the beach, a memorial service for all who had died in the Pacific War. American and Japanese veterans stood together as the sun set over the water, each holding a candle, each remembering friends and enemies who had fallen. The Buddhist priests and Christian chaplains took turns offering prayers, their different traditions blending into something that transcended doctrine. And when the moment came to release paper lanterns onto the water, each bearing the name of someone lost, Kobayashi wrote Jimmy's name on his lantern while Margaret wrote the names of Japanese soldiers she tried and failed to save in those terrible days after battle. They stood side by side as the lanterns drifted out to sea, small lights floating on the dark water like stars that had fallen from the sky. Margaret's hand found Kobayashi's, and they held on to each other as they'd done once before in a hospital tent a lifetime ago. Around them, old warriors wept openly, releasing grief they'd carried for decades, forgiving themselves and each other for what war had made them do. It was beautiful and heartbreaking in equal measure, a moment of collective healing that both Kobayashi and Margaret recognized as sacred. "I wish we'd had more time," Margaret said later, as they sat together in the hotel lobby. The conference was ending, and in the morning they would return to their separate lives on opposite sides of the Pacific. 26 years apart, and only 3 days together. It doesn't seem fair. Kobayashi smiled, and in that smile was all the wisdom of his years. We have had more than time, Margaret. We have had something that transcends time. What you gave me, what we gave each other. It doesn't end when we say goodbye. It continues in everything we do, everyone we touch, every life we change by choosing compassion over hatred. This is not ending. This is continuation. They exchanged addresses before parting, promised to write, to stay in contact, and this time they kept that promise. For the next 12 years, letters crossed the Pacific regularly, two old friends sharing their lives, their thoughts, their hopes for a world that seemed always teetering between peace and conflict. Kobayashi sent photos of his grandchildren, shared stories about his students, wrote about the changing face of Japan. Margaret responded with news of her family, her volunteer work, her thoughts on American politics and culture. The correspondence became a treasured part of both their lives, a connection that enriched their final years. In 1983, Margaret's letters stopped coming. Kobayashi waited anxiously for months before finally receiving a letter from Elizabeth, written in careful, practiced English. Her mother had passed away peacefully in her sleep, her heart simply wearing out after 73 years of beating. She'd left specific instructions that Kobayashi was to be notified, that he was to know how much his friendship had meant to her, and that he was to have something she'd prepared for him. The package arrived 2 weeks later, carefully wrapped and marked fragile. Inside, Kobayashi found a letter in Margaret's handwriting, shaky now with age, but still unmistakably hers. With it was a photograph he'd never seen before, Margaret in her army nurse uniform, standing in front of the hospital tent on Guam, squinting against the tropical sun. On the back, she'd written in faded ink, "For Masao, who taught me that enemies are just friends we haven't met yet, with love and gratitude, Margaret." The letter was longer, written over several days as her strength allowed. In it, she reflected on their shared history, on the moment that had brought them together, and the friendship that had sustained them both. She wrote about the importance of remembering, not just the horrors of war, but the moments of grace that proved humanity could triumph over hatred. She expressed her hope that their story would continue to inspire others, that it would be told and retold as an example of what was possible when people chose compassion. "I am not afraid to die," she wrote near the end. "I have lived a good life, loved and been loved, made my small contribution to healing the wounds of war, and I have had you, my dear friend, as proof that the best parts of humanity can survive even the worst we do to each other. When they put me in the ground, I'll go with a smile, knowing that somewhere in Japan, there's a man who remembers a young nurse who chose Kamian. Kindness, and who made that choice mean something by living a life of bridge building and peace. That's more than most people get, and I am grateful." Kobayashi wept when he finished reading, great racking sobs that shook his aging frame. His wife, patient and understanding as always, held him until the storm of grief passed. And then, with the clarity that comes after tears, he knew what he had to do. Margaret's story, their story, couldn't die with her. It needed to be told, to be shared, to continue inspiring long after both of them were gone. He began writing, setting down everything he remembered from that August in 1945, to their reunion in Hawaii, to their years of correspondence. He wrote about pain and healing, about war and peace, about the power of one person's choice to see the humanity in an enemy. The memoir took him 2 years to complete, written in both Japanese and English, but testimony to the woman who had saved not just his life, but his soul. He titled it simply, "Because You're a Human Being, the story of Nurse Margaret Wilson and the enemy she saved." The book was published in 1985, 40 years after the end of the war, and it became an unexpected phenomenon. In Japan, it resonated with a generation that had grown up in peace, that knew the war only from textbooks and their grandparents' stories. Here was a first-hand account that humanized the enemy, that showed both the horror of conflict and the possibility of reconciliation. In America, where it was published the following year, it found an audience hungry for stories of redemption and hope. Veterans of the Pacific War read it and wept, recognizing their own experiences in Kobayashi's words. Young people read it and gained a new understanding of what their grandparents had endured and overcome. Kobayashi found himself in demand as a speaker, invited to schools and universities, peace conferences and veterans gatherings. Despite his advancing age, he accepted as many invitations as his health allowed, driven by the promise he'd made to Margaret all those years ago. He spoke to schoolchildren in Tokyo and Osaka, telling them about the nurse who taught him that enemies were human. He addressed American veterans in San Francisco and Seattle, assuring them that their sacrifices had led to lasting peace and friendship. He traveled to Hiroshima and spoke at the Peace Memorial, his voice breaking as he described how one act of kindness had been powerful enough to overcome even the shadow of the atomic bomb. At one such speaking engagement, a high school in Kyoto not far from where he'd grown up, a student raised her hand during the question period. "Kobayashi-sensei," she asked with the directness of youth, "do you think the war was necessary for you to learn this lesson about humanity? Could you have learned it in peace?" The question struck Kobayashi silent for a moment, its profundity unexpected from one so young. He thought about Margaret, about Jimmy, whose photograph he'd carried for decades, about all the millions who died in the Pacific War. He thought about the price of the lesson he'd learned, paid in blood and fire and unimaginable suffering. "No," he said finally, and his voice carried to every corner of the silent auditorium. "The war was not necessary. The lessons I learned, that we all learned, they could have been taught without death, without destruction. The tragedy is that we needed such horror to remind us of our shared humanity, that it took the worst of human nature to bring out the best in people like Nurse Wilson. We must remember the war, yes, but not to glorify it or to justify it. We must remember it as a terrible teacher whose lessons should never need to be taught again." End quote. The student nodded, satisfied with the answer, and Kobayashi continued, "But here is where I want you to understand. Even in the midst of that unnecessary horror, people made choices. Margaret Wilson could have treated me as the enemy, could have done the minimum required by law, and left it at that. She chose differently. She chose to see me as human, to treat me with compassion, to plant a seed that would grow into friendship and understanding. That choice, that is what we must remember and emulate. We cannot prevent all conflict, cannot stop all hatred, but we can choose, in every moment, to respond with humanity, rather than with cruelty. That is the real lesson, and it applies in peace as much as in war." As Kobayashi entered his 80s, his body began to fail in the ways bodies do. His children urged him to rest, to stop the exhausting travel and speaking schedule, but he couldn't. There were still people who needed to hear the story, still hearts that needed to understand what Margaret had taught him. He pushed on, driven by a sense of purpose that transcended physical limitation, until finally, his doctors insisted he slow down or face serious consequences. In his retirement, Kobayashi turned his home into an unofficial museum of sorts. The photograph of Jimmy, the Bible Margaret had given him, her letter from beyond the grave, and countless other mementos from their friendship were displayed with reverence. He welcomed visitors, students and researchers, veterans and peace activists, anyone who wanted to understand the story of the nurse and the pilot. He would serve them tea in the Japanese manner, and then, settling into his favorite chair with a blanket over his knees, he would tell them about Margaret, about kindness in the midst of war, about the bridge that had been built between enemies. One visitor, a young American doctoral student researching reconciliation narratives, asked him why he thought the story had such enduring power. "There are thousands of stories from the war," she said. "Thousands of moments of kindness between enemies. Why does yours resonate so deeply?" Kobayashi considered the question, his fingers automatically reaching for the photograph of Margaret that he kept on the table beside his chair. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "it is because it is both extraordinary and ordinary. Extraordinary because it happened in such extreme circumstances, because it crossed such deep divides of nation and culture and conflict, but ordinary because it required only what every human possesses, the ability to choose compassion, to see past hatred and fear to the common humanity beneath. People respond to the story because they see themselves in it. They see that they too could be Margaret, or they too could be me. The one who needed kindness, or the one who gave it. It gives hope that even the greatest hatreds can be overcome, that peace is always possible if we choose it. The student nodded, writing quickly in her notebook. And do you think that peace, that reconciliation between Japan and America, would have happened without people like you and Nurse Wilson? It would have happened, Kobayashi replied with certainty. Nations make peace through treaties and trade, through shared interests and diplomatic necessity. But people make peace through connection, through seeing each other as human. What Margaret and I did, what thousands of others did in their own ways, was to give face and feeling to the abstract concept of reconciliation. We made it personal, real, something that lived in hearts rather than just in policy documents. That matters, I think. It makes the peace deeper, more resilient, harder to break." End quote. As his 90th birthday approached, Kobayashi's family planned a celebration, a gathering of children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, a testament to the life he'd lived beyond the war. But he had one more request, one final wish, before he allowed himself to be fully celebrated. He wanted to return to Guam, to see the place where his life had changed, to stand once more on the ground where he'd fallen and been raised up by unexpected kindness. The journey was difficult, his body protesting every moment of the long flight. But when he stepped off the plane, onto Guamanian soil, feeling the tropical heat that he remembered so well, Kobayashi felt young again, felt the presence of his younger self and of Margaret walking beside him. His grandson, who'd accompanied him on this pilgrimage, helped him into a rental car, and together they drove to where the field hospital had stood all those decades ago. Of course, it was gone. The tents had been struck in late 1945, the wounded evacuated, the medical staff sent home or to new postings. The jungle had reclaimed much of the area, though now it was manicured jungle, part of a memorial park dedicated to the battle for Guam. Kobayashi stood in the parking lot, trying to orient himself, trying to see past the present to the past that lived so vividly in his memory. "It was there," he said to his grandson, pointing to a spot now occupied by a monument to fallen Marines. "The tent where Margaret worked, where she saved my life, and there." He turned slowly, his arm sweeping toward a stand of palms. "That's where we sat on my last day, where she gave me the photograph and the Bible." They walked slowly through the park, Kobayashi leaning heavily on his grandson's arm. He showed the young man where his Zero had crashed, now just jungle with no trace of the violence that had occurred there. He described the hospital, the rows of cots, the smell of disinfectant and blood, the sounds of suffering men. And he told him about Margaret, painting her picture so vividly that his grandson could almost see her moving through the tent, bringing comfort to the wounded and dying. At the monument, Kobayashi stood in silence for a long time, remembering. The names carved into the stone were American, Marines who died taking this island, and he felt the weight of their sacrifice. They had been the enemy once, men he'd been trained to kill, whose deaths would have been his victory. But now, they were just young men who'd died far from home, who'd given everything for a cause they believed in, who deserved to be remembered and honored regardless of which flag they'd fought under. "Margaret taught me this," he said softly, his hand resting on the warm stone of the monument. "She taught me that there are no enemies in death, only humans who suffered and died. She taught me that remembrance must include everyone, victor and vanquished alike, because grief doesn't recognize borders. And loss is loss, regardless of the uniform it wears." His grandson, moved beyond words, simply nodded and held his grandfather's arm a little tighter. They stood together until the sun began to set, until the shadows grew long and the heat began to fade. And then, with one last look at the place that had changed everything, Kobayashi allowed himself to be led back to the car, back to the airport, back to the life that Margaret's kindness had made possible. Masao Kobayashi died peacefully in his sleep on a spring morning in 2003, 3 months past his 93rd birthday. He was surrounded by family, his children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, filling the house with their presence. On the nightstand beside his bed were 2 photographs, one of his wife who'd preceded him in death by 5 years, and one of a young woman in an army nurse uniform, squinting against the Guamanian sun, who'd given him the gift of understanding that enemies could become friends, that hatred could transform into love, that war's darkest moments could give birth to peace's brightest possibilities. His funeral was attended by hundreds, Japanese and Americans alike, people whose lives had been touched by his story, by his tireless advocacy for peace and reconciliation. The U.S. ambassador to Japan came, as did several Diet members and peace activists from around the world. They spoke of his contributions to Japanese-American friendship, his work promoting understanding between former enemies, his unwavering commitment to the principles Margaret had embodied on that distant Korea. August Day, in 1945. But perhaps the most moving tribute came from Margaret's daughter, Elizabeth, now an elderly woman herself, who had flown from California to pay her respects to the man who'd meant so much to her mother. She stood before the assembly and spoke in careful Japanese, learned specifically for this occasion, about the connection between her mother and Kobayashi, about how their friendship had shaped both their lives and rippled out to touch countless others. "My mother used to say that in the midst of war's hatred, she found proof of love's power," Elizabeth said, her voice strong despite her tears. She said that Masao, this enemy pilot who became her friend, taught her that every choice we make for compassion over cruelty helps heal the world. She carried that lesson with her for the rest of her life, and through Masao, she shared it with millions. Today we mourn a great man, but we also celebrate a great friendship, one that proved peace is not just possible but inevitable when we remember our shared humanity." End quote. The story didn't end with Kobayashi's death. His memoir remained in print, translated into dozens of languages, read by new generations seeking to understand how enemies became friends, how war gave way to peace. Schools used it as a teaching tool. Peace organizations cited it in their literature. Veterans found solace in its message of reconciliation. The photograph of Jimmy that Margaret had given Kobayashi was donated to the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, where it sits in a place of honor, a testament to love and loss, and the kindness that can transcend both. In Kyoto, a small museum was established in Kobayashi's memory, dedicated to Japanese-American friendship and the lessons of World War II. It houses his papers, his correspondence with Margaret, the Bible she gave him, and countless artifacts from his life of bridge building. Young people visit it, students and scholars, veterans and peace activists, all seeking to understand how two people from opposite sides of history's bloodiest war could forge a friendship that would inspire millions. And on Guam, at the memorial park where the field hospital once stood, a new plaque was installed in 2005. It tells the story of Lieutenant Masao Kobayashi and Nurse Margaret Wilson, of an enemy pilot and the woman who showed him kindness, of a moment of compassion in the midst of war that proved humanity's capacity for good could survive even the worst we do to each other. The plaque ends with the words, "Margaret spoke all those years ago, the words that changed everything, because you're a human being." Visitors stand before that plaque, Japanese and American, people from every nation, and they understand something fundamental about the human condition. They understand that we are not defined by our worst moments, our greatest hatreds, our deepest conflicts. We are defined by our choices, by our capacity to see past difference to similarity, by our willingness to extend compassion even to those we've been taught to hate. They understand that peace is built not in grand gestures or diplomatic treaties alone, but in the small, brave acts of individuals who choose kindness over cruelty, understanding over hatred, love over fear. Margaret Wilson and Masao Kobayashi, a nurse and a pilot, an American and a Japanese, enemies who became friends. Their story lives on. It lives in the hearts of those who hear it, in the choices made by people who understand that every human being deserves dignity and compassion, in the gradually healing wounds of a world still learning the lessons they taught. Their legacy is not just in books or museums or memorial plaques, but in every act of kindness between former enemies, every bridge built across divides, every moment when someone chooses to see the humanity in another despite every reason to look away. In the end, that was Margaret's gift to Masao, and through him, to the world. The understanding that we are all human beings, all deserving of compassion, all capable of change, all connected by our shared vulnerability and strength. It was a simple truth, easily forgotten in times of conflict, but powerful enough to transform lives, to heal nations, to prove that even the darkest night of war can give way to the dawn of peace. If only we have the courage to choose kindness, to see the human being before us, to remember that enemies are just friends we haven't yet had the chance to know. Years after Kobayashi's death, his granddaughter Yuki found herself standing in that same museum in Kyoto, now working as its curator. She had grown up hearing her grandfather's stories, had sat at his feet as a child listening to him speak of the nurse who had changed his life. But it wasn't until she took this position, immersing herself in his papers and artifacts, that she truly understood the depth of what had transpired between him and Margaret Wilson. Among the documents, she discovered something her grandfather had never shown the family: a series of journal entries he'd written in the months following his return to Japan, raw and unfiltered reflections on his transformation. The journals revealed a man struggling with immense psychological weight. Kobayashi had written about the nightmares that plagued him, not of battle, but of the realization that he'd been fighting for lies. He described the cognitive dissonance of reconciling his indoctrination with the reality of American kindness. One entry, dated October 1946, was particularly haunting. "I wake at night," he had written in Japanese characters that trembled across the page, "and I see the faces of men I killed. I dropped bombs on cities, fired my guns at ships and planes, ended lives without thought, because I believed they were less than human. But they were human, just as human as Margaret, just as deserving of mercy. How do I live with what I've done? How do I forgive myself when I cannot undo the harm?" Yuki read these entries with tears streaming down her face, understanding for the first time the cost of her grandfather's transformation. It hadn't been a simple, clean conversion from hatred to love. It had been a painful, wrenching process of confronting his own complicity in atrocity, of accepting that he had been both victim and perpetrator, both innocent and guilty. Margaret's kindness had opened a door, but walking through it had required him to face truths that would have been easier to deny. Another entry, this one from November of that same year, showed the beginning of his path forward. "I cannot change what I have done," he wrote, "but I can dedicate what remains of my life to ensuring it never happens again. Margaret showed me that transformation is possible, that we can choose differently. If I can help even one person see past their hatred, if I can prevent even one act of violence by teaching the lessons I learned in that hospital tent, then perhaps my life will have meaning beyond the destruction I caused." Yuki decided to publish these journals as a companion volume to her grandfather's memoir. The publisher was hesitant at first, worried that revealing Kobayashi's inner turmoil might diminish the inspirational power of his story. But Yuki argued passionately that the opposite was true, that showing the difficulty of transformation, the genuine struggle required to overcome hatred and guilt, made the story more powerful, not less. "My grandfather's legacy isn't that peace is easy," she told them. "It's that peace is possible even when it's hard, even when we have to confront the worst parts of ourselves to achieve it." The journals were published in 2008, and they added new dimensions to a story that many thought they already knew. Readers responded powerfully to this more complete portrait of Kobayashi, seeing in his struggles a mirror of their own difficulties in overcoming prejudice, letting go of hatred, or forgiving themselves for past wrongs. Letters poured into the museum from around the world, people sharing their own stories of transformation, of moments when someone's kindness had challenged their assumptions and changed their path. One letter came from a former American soldier who'd fought in Vietnam. He described his own journey from bitter hatred of the Vietnamese to a gradual understanding, facilitated by a chance encounter with a former enemy soldier at a reconciliation event. "Reading your grandfather's journals," he wrote, "I finally understood that I wasn't weak for letting go of my anger. I wasn't betraying my fallen comrades by seeing the humanity in those who fought against us. I was honoring the best possibilities of human nature. The same thing Nurse Wilson honored when she treated your grandfather with compassion. Thank you for sharing his struggle. It's helped me make peace with my own." End quote. Another letter arrived from a teacher in Rwanda who had been using Kobayashi's story in her classroom to help students understand reconciliation in the wake of genocide. "Your grandfather's words give my students permission to imagine a different future," she wrote. "They have been taught to hate, have lost family members to violence, have every reason to carry that hatred forever. But when they see that a Japanese pilot and an American nurse could find friendship across such a divide, they begin to believe that Hutu and Tutsi can do the same. This is not abstract philosophy to them. It is a roadmap, a proof that the impossible can become possible." The renewed interest in Kobayashi's story led to a documentary film produced jointly by Japanese and American filmmakers. They interviewed surviving people who had known both Kobayashi and Margaret, tracked down former patients from the field hospital on Guam, and found Marines who had been present at his capture. The film wove together archival footage, dramatic recreations, and these contemporary interviews to create a powerful meditation on war, peace, and the human capacity for change. During production, the filmmakers made an extraordinary discovery. In the National Archives, buried in boxes of medical records from the Pacific Theater, they found Margaret's own diary from her time on Guam. It had been donated years earlier by a relative clearing out her effects, but its significance had gone unrecognized until researchers went looking specifically for information about her. The diary entries from August 1945 provided Margaret's perspective on her encounter with Kobayashi, revealing depths to the story that neither of them had fully articulated. August 15, 1945. One entry read in Margaret's neat, precise handwriting. "They brought in a Japanese pilot today, shot down over the island. He's young, maybe younger than Jimmy was. When I looked at him, broken and bleeding and terrified, I couldn't see the enemy. I could only see a boy who's probably wondering if he'll ever see his mother again. Just like I wonder if I'll ever know what happened to Jimmy. The other nurses don't understand why I volunteered to care for him. They think I should hate him, and maybe I should. But I keep thinking, what if someone showed kindness to Jimmy? What if, wherever he is, someone saw past the uniform to the human being? I have to believe that's possible. I have to be that person for this pilot, because if I'm not, then what was any of this for?" Another entry, dated August 20th, showed her growing connection to Kobayashi. "The Japanese pilot, I learned his name is Masao, seems confused by kindness. He keeps asking why I help him, and I'm not sure I have an answer that would translate even if we spoke the same language. How do I explain that I need to help him? That treating him like a human being is the only way I can hold on to my own humanity in this place of death? He doesn't realize that he's helping me as much as I'm helping him. Every time I choose compassion over hatred, I prove to myself that the war hasn't destroyed everything good in me." End quote. The final entry about Kobayashi was written on August 24th, the day he left the hospital. "Masao was transferred to a POW camp today. I gave him Jimmy's photograph, and I saw in his eyes that he understood what it meant. He bowed to me in that formal Japanese way, and there were tears on his face. I wanted to tell him so many things, that I hoped he'd make it home, that I hoped he'd find peace, that I hoped he'd remember this moment and let it change him. But we couldn't communicate well enough for that conversation, so I settled for hugging him, breaking every rule in the book, and hoping he understood. I think he did. I pray he did, because if this war can produce even one friendship, one genuine connection between enemies, then maybe there's hope for all of us when the fighting finally stops." The filmmakers incorporated these diary entries into the documentary, having actresses read them in voiceover while archival footage and recreations played on screen. The effect was powerful, showing both sides of the encounter, the pilot and the nurse, each grappling with their humanity in circumstances designed to strip it away. The documentary premiered at film festivals around the world, winning awards and introducing Kobayashi and Margaret's story to millions who had never heard it before. One screening took place at a small theater in Iowa, in the very town where Margaret had grown up. Her surviving relatives attended, including Elizabeth, now in her 80s, but still sharp and engaged. After the film, during the question and answer session, a young veteran stood up. He'd served in Iraq and Afghanistan, and he spoke haltingly about his own struggles with what he'd done in combat, with the civilians who died in firefights, with the moral injuries that kept him awake at night. "How did he do it?" the veteran asked, his voice breaking. How did Kobayashi live with what he'd done? How did he forgive himself? Elizabeth stood slowly, her daughter helping her to her feet. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who had spent her life thinking about these questions, shaped by her mother's experiences and friendships. "My mother used to say that Masao never fully forgave himself," she began. "She said he carried the weight of what he'd done until the day he died. But he learned to transform that weight into purpose. He couldn't undo the harm he'd caused. So, he dedicated himself to preventing future harm. He couldn't bring back the people he'd killed, so he worked to build a world where their deaths might be the last of their kind. Forgiveness, my mother believed, wasn't about forgetting or excusing. It was about choosing to move forward, to be better, to let your past mistakes fuel your future actions rather than paralyze you." The veteran nodded, wiping his eyes, and Elizabeth continued, "But here's what I think you really need to hear. What my mother would want you to know. You're asking the right questions. The fact that you're struggling with these moral issues, that you're here seeking understanding, means you haven't lost your humanity. That's what war tries to take from us, our ability to see the humanity in others and in ourselves. But you're fighting to keep it. That fight, that struggle, that's what honor really looks like. Not the clean, simple narratives they sell in recruitment ads, but the messy, painful work of remaining human in inhuman circumstances." End quote. The exchange was captured on video and went viral online, viewed by millions of veterans and civilians alike. It sparked conversations about moral injury, about the long-term psychological costs of war, about the support that veterans needed not just for their physical wounds, but for the wounds to their souls. Kobayashi and Margaret's story became part of a larger dialogue about healing, both individual and collective, about how societies recover from the trauma of conflict. In Japan, a group of educators developed a curriculum based on Kobayashi's life, designed for middle and high school students. The program used his story as a framework for teaching critical thinking about propaganda, nationalism, and the importance of questioning authority. Students read his memoir alongside primary sources from the war, analyzing how the Japanese government had manipulated information to dehumanize the enemy. They studied the American occupation and the rebuilding of Japan, examining how former enemies had become allies. And they reflected on contemporary conflicts, considering how the lessons of 1945 applied to the 21st century. One teacher, implementing the curriculum in a school in Hiroshima, reported remarkable results. "My students started the unit with typical adolescent cynicism," he wrote in an education journal. "They thought war was something from the distant past, irrelevant to their lives. But as they engaged with Kobayashi's story, something shifted. They began to understand that war starts with small dehumanizations, with the gradual erosion of empathy, with people choosing tribal loyalty over universal humanity." One student said, "To me, Kobayashi-san's story shows that we all have the power to choose differently, to be like Nurse Wilson, even when everyone around us is choosing hatred. That's the kind of thinking that can change the world." The curriculum spread beyond Japan, adapted for use in American schools, European schools, schools in conflict zones around the world. In each place, teachers found that Kobayashi and Margaret's story resonated with their students, providing a concrete example of abstract concepts like reconciliation, empathy, and peace-building. The story was personal enough to be emotionally engaging, but universal enough to apply across cultures and contexts. In 2015, 70 years after the end of World War II, a special ceremony was held simultaneously in Tokyo and Washington, D.C. The Japanese and American governments jointly announced the establishment of the Kobayashi Wilson Peace Fellowship, a program that would bring together young leaders from countries in conflict to study peace-building and reconciliation. The fellows would spend a year learning about conflict resolution, studying historical examples of successful peace processes, and developing projects to apply in their home countries. The first cohort of fellows included participants from Israel and Palestine, India and Pakistan, Armenia and Azerbaijan, South Sudan and a dozen other conflict zones. They gathered first in Guam, at the memorial park where the field hospital had stood, for an orientation that focused on the story that had inspired the program. Standing before the plaque that commemorated Kobayashi and Margaret, fellows from opposite sides of bitter conflicts heard how an enemy pilot and an American nurse had forged a friendship that had rippled across decades. One fellow, a young Palestinian woman named Layla, spoke about the impact of that moment. "I stood there with an Israeli fellow standing beside me," she later recounted. "And I realized that our conflict isn't unique. It isn't special or unsolvable. Japanese and Americans killed each other by the millions, used weapons of unimaginable horror, committed atrocities that seemed to make peace impossible. But here we were, 70 years later, standing in a place that celebrated their friendship, their reconciliation. If they could do it, why couldn't we?" That thought, that possibility, it changed something in me. The fellowship program became one of the most successful peace-building initiatives of the 21st century. Over the years, it produced leaders who went on to negotiate peace agreements, establish reconciliation commissions, create programs that brought together people divided by conflict. They carried with them the lesson of Kobayashi and Margaret, that peace begins with individual choices to see the humanity in the enemy, to extend compassion even when hatred seems justified, to believe in the sakure possibility of transformation. Yuki, continuing her work as curator of the Kobayashi Museum, began receiving artifacts and stories from the fellows. They sent her photos of their work, reports on their projects, testimonials about how her grandfather's story had influenced their paths. She created a new wing of the museum dedicated to these contemporary peace builders, showing how Kobayashi and Margaret's legacy lived on in the work of people they had never met, in conflicts they could never have imagined. One display featured a letter from a fellow who had been a child soldier in Sierra Leone. He had done terrible things, had been forced to commit atrocities that haunted him. But reading Kobayashi's journals, understanding that transformation was possible even for someone who had killed in war, had given him hope. He went on to establish a rehabilitation program for former child soldiers, helping them process their trauma and reintegrate into society. "Your grandfather showed me," he wrote to Yuki, "that we are not defined by the worst things we've done in the worst circumstances. We are defined by what we choose to do after, by whether we let our past destroy us or whether we transform it into fuel for creating, a better future." The museum also displayed a photograph sent by an Israeli and Palestinian pair of fellows who had become close friends during their fellowship year. They stood together at the border between their territories, arms around each other's shoulders, holding a sign that read, "Enemies to Friends," following the path of Kobayashi and Wilson. The accompanying letter explained that they were working together on a project bringing Israeli and Palestinian youth together for dialogue and joint service projects. "We face skepticism from both our communities," they wrote. "People say we're naive, that we're betraying our sides. But we remember that people said the same about Nurse Wilson when she showed kindness to an enemy pilot. We're honored to continue their work." As the museum's collection grew, Yuki began to understand something profound about her grandfather's legacy. It wasn't just about one friendship, one moment of kindness in 1945. It was about the principle that friendship demonstrated, the proof it provided that human beings could transcend even the deepest divisions. Every person who chose compassion over hatred, who extended humanity to an enemy, who worked for peace in the face of conflict, was continuing what Kobayashi and Margaret had started. In 2020, Yuki received a message that would bring the story full circle in an unexpected way. A researcher in the United States had been studying Margaret's family history and had discovered something remarkable. Margaret had a great-grandson named David Patterson, who was serving in the U.S. military as a medic. Through a series of coincidences and deployments, David found himself stationed in Japan, working at a military hospital that sometimes treated civilians from the surrounding community. David reached out to Yuki, explaining that he'd grown up hearing stories about his great-grandmother's friendship with a Japanese pilot, but had never fully understood its significance until he found himself living in Japan. He wanted to visit the museum, to connect with his great-grandmother's legacy in this place that had meant so much to her. Yuki immediately invited him, sensing that this meeting represented something important, a continuation of the connection between their families. When David arrived at the museum, Yuki greeted him in the entrance hall, beneath a large photograph of Kobayashi and Margaret from their reunion in Hawaii. They stood together, looking at the image of their ancestors, two people whose friendship had shaped both their family histories. David was struck by the resemblance between Yuki and her grandfather. The same thoughtful eyes, the same careful way of moving. Yuki saw in David echoes of Margaret, particularly in his hands, which had the same long fingers she'd seen in old photographs. "Your great-grandmother saved my grandfather's life," Yuki said softly. "But it was more than that. She saved his soul, his humanity. Without her, he would have died bitter and broken, or lived consumed by hatred and guilt. She gave him the gift of seeing another way, and he spent the rest of his life paying that gift forward." David nodded, emotion thick in his voice. "And your grandfather gave my great-grandmother something too. She struggled after the war, wondered if anything she'd done had mattered, if all the death and suffering had any meaning. But knowing that she'd changed your grandfather's life, that he'd become this force for peace and reconciliation, it gave her purpose. It let her believe that even small acts of kindness could have enormous consequences." End quote. They spent the day together, Yuki showing David every part of the museum, sharing stories and documents, building a friendship of their own. David told her about his work as a medic, about the Japanese civilians he'd treated, about how he tried to approach each patient with the same compassion his great-grandmother had shown. Yuki shared her vision for the museum's future, her hopes to expand its programming to reach even more people with the message of peace and reconciliation. As evening approached, they sat together in the museum's meditation room, a space designed for quiet reflection, with windows looking out onto a traditional Japanese garden. The room was filled with the soft light of sunset, and in that gentle illumination, David pulled something from his bag, a small wooden box, worn with age. "My grandmother Elizabeth gave this to me before I deployed to Japan," he said, opening the box carefully. Inside was a medal, tarnished with age, and a folded piece of paper. "This was my great-grandmother's Army Nurse Corps medal, and this," he unfolded the paper with reverent care, "is the last letter she ever wrote, just before she died. My grandmother kept it private all these years, but she wanted you to have it now." Yuki took the letter with trembling hands. Margaret's handwriting was shaky, the words written by someone whose strength was fading, but the message was clear and powerful. "To whoever carries our story forward," Margaret had written, "know that peace is not a destination but a journey. Not a treaty, but a choice made every day by millions of people. Masao and I were just two of those people. Two who happened to meet in circumstances that made our choice visible, memorable. But the real work of peace is done by countless others whose names will never be known, whose kindness goes unrecorded, whose choices to see the humanity in others happen in small moments that no one commemorates. Honor our story if you wish, but more importantly, live it. Be the person who extends compassion to the enemy. Be the one who builds bridges across divides. Be the one who proves that transformation is possible. That is how you honor what Masao and I began. That is how our friendship becomes immortal." Yuki finished reading with tears streaming down her face. This message, written by Margaret in her final days, captured everything her grandfather had spent his life trying to teach. It wasn't about them. Not really. It was about the principle they represented, the possibility they proved, the path they had shown could be walked by anyone willing to choose compassion over hatred. "We should share this," Yuki said finally. "This letter. It belongs to everyone who's trying to build peace. Will you give permission?" David nodded without hesitation. "That's why grandmother gave it to me to bring here. She said it was time, that the world needed this message now more than ever." The letter was published in the museum's newsletter and quickly spread across the internet. It was translated into dozens of languages, shared by peace organizations, quoted by leaders and activists. In a world that often seemed to be fragmenting, dividing along lines of nationality, religion, and ideology, Margaret's words reminded people that another way was possible, that the choice for peace and understanding was always available, that every person had the power to be what the world needed. The publication of the letter coincided with growing tensions in several parts of the world, new conflicts threatening to erupt, old hatreds being stoked by leaders seeking power through division. But Margaret's words, and the story behind them, provided a counter-narrative, a reminder that enemies could become friends. That peace was possible even after the worst atrocities, that the human capacity for compassion could overcome the human capacity for cruelty. In classrooms and living rooms, in government offices and refugee camps, in places of worship and places of conflict, people read Margaret's final letter and thought about their own choices. Some reached out to enemies and began dialogues that would lead to reconciliation. Others chose to forgive those who had harmed them, breaking cycles of revenge that had persisted for generations. Still others simply decided to treat the next person they met, whoever they were, with kindness and respect, understanding that peace begins with such small decisions made by ordinary people in ordinary moments. And so the story of Lieutenant Masao Kobayashi and Nurse Margaret Wilson continued to ripple outward, touching lives they never knew, inspiring choices they never witnessed, building a world they never saw, but always believed was possible. Their friendship, born in the ashes of war, had become a seed of peace, growing and spreading, proving that even in the darkest times, even in the midst of humanity's worst impulses, the light of compassion could never be fully extinguished, and given the chance, it would always find a way to grow, to spread, to transform the world one human heart at a time.